In this video, we're going to talk about 3 reasons why you should be afraid of working in big tech. I've spent the last few years in the industry working at some of the largest tech companies in the world. But prior to this, I worked at startups, with the smallest startup being about 40 people. Now that I've worked at startups and some of the biggest companies in the world, I've realized that working in big tech isn't really all that it's chalked up to be. Be sure to stay to the end of the video to learn 3 of the most common myths that people fall for when they actually join big tech companies. While there's many benefits to working in big tech companies, there's also a handful of downsides that I think are less discussed in the tech community, especially becoming complacent. Prior to joining a big tech company, it was really hard for me to shut off my brain after work. I'd constantly be writing down ideas for businesses I could start or side hustles that could earn me extra cash. This was largely due to the fact that while I was able to pay my rent and live in New York City, I had to constantly keep an eye on my finances to make sure that I was living within my means. New York City is expensive. Coming out of college, the first startup I joined had one component to their compensation, and that was my yearly salary. No signing bonus, no end of year bonuses, and no restricted stock units or RSUs. And technically, my offer included stock options, but I look at those largely as lottery tickets because, to be totally honest with you, I would have rather have had 50 scratch-off tickets. And since those stock options actually had 1-year cliff vesting, I did not get any of those stock options because I was laid off after working for the company for about 8 months. So feeling more strapped for cash, back then I constantly did things outside of work to try and earn extra money, like tutoring high school students in computer science, conducting mock coding interviews, starting this YouTube channel, which made no money back then, and running a startup that was related to 3D printing with a friend. All of this is to say that I was motivated to do things after work. After joining big tech, things look very different after work, mostly for 2 different reasons. First, fortunately, I don't feel the same financial stress I did while working at my first job out of college. Working in the industry for a few years has allowed me to build up a nice nest egg for myself in case anything ever happens, and luckily, my compensation includes more than just a yearly salary now. Second, and more importantly, the things that you're allowed to do after work when you work in big tech are sadly more limited. You see, when you join large tech companies, you're often required to sign prior inventions contracts to explicitly state the things that you've worked on and own prior to joining the company. And this is so that there's no confusion as to who owns what intellectual property going forward once you've actually joined that company. If you've ever watched the movie The Social Network, or you know the story of Facebook, you probably know why people have these contracts. And anything that you actually do outside of work on your own hardware and outside of work hours still needs to make sure that it falls outside of your company's business interests to make sure that there's no conflict of interest for the things that you work on in your free time. The problem with this is that some of these tech companies are so large that they have their hands in literally almost every industry imaginable. So even if you actually do work on something in your own time and on your own hardware, it's very possible that that thing that you work on falls within your company's business interest and therefore classify as a conflict of interest. I remember when I signed my Amazon contract, there was actually a clause within that contract that had me acknowledge that Amazon is a global company with a very large sphere of influence, which roughly translates to Amazon being in basically every facet of business. And therefore, it really felt like anything that I would even consider working on, again, even if it's in my own time and not on their hardware, it'd probably be a problem because they are already in that business. And I know what you're thinking. Your company probably doesn't care at all what you do in your free time. But I'm sorry to tell you, I've actually already had corporate lawyers reach out to me on one occasion, effectively sending me a cease and desist for something I created and own prior to joining that company. But that's a story for another time. It's also worth mentioning that I think startups might technically have you sign these contracts, but at the same time, I've never actually seen a really small startup go after people for things that they do on their own time. And I think that's largely because of the fact that startups tend to monitor what you do on and off the clock way less than really large companies. So I feel like the possibility of you falling into litigation with a startup is way less probable. Regardless, the change in motivation I've felt to do things after work when transitioning from smaller tech companies to larger tech companies is palpable. And it's definitely something that you should not take lightly when you're discussing your next move in the tech industry. And I'm not even saying that it's bad, it's just something that you should probably think about. And after what we just discussed, it's probably no wonder why you might not be jumping to learn new technologies outside of work. Anything that you learn and use to build new projects is in the worst case a lawsuit, and in the best case maybe a conflict of interest, which is stressful. And I mean, sure, I guess you could always learn that new technology and build with it locally, but you probably can't really publicize it, or at least I would rather not, because I'd rather sleep well knowing that the stupid to-do list app that I built for the 35th time in a new framework is not going to jeopardize my livelihood. It's also no secret that large tech companies also love their internal tooling, much of which is not public or open source, and therefore it's not used at other companies. Because of this, some of the tools, frameworks, skills, and even programming languages that you learn at some of these big tech companies won't transition to be able to be useful at other companies that you might work at in the future. And while it's not in your best interest as a software engineer to ignore the things that might be gaining traction in the larger tech community, it's probably really hard to convince yourself to learn those things when maybe your entire job relies on hack, Facebook's internal version of PHP. And it's funny because learning all these different internal things at these companies reminds you of like the idea of reading and learning about poetry, but then never actually being able to write it. I mean, sure, I guess you could write your own poems in your own notebook, but you can't actually publish anything ever. And I mean, if I'm going to be a poet, I want everyone to know it. See what I did there? As a simple example, one of the internal technologies that was developed at Google was called protobuf. Protobuf is an extremely efficient data format that's used to serialize structured data. It was actually created internally back in 2001 as a means for a more efficient way to store structured data at rest and transmit data over the wire in a very compressed format. And at the time, other widely used data formats like JSON or SOAP actually did not meet the needs of Google's growing scale. And now if we were to fast forward to 2008, protobuf is actually open source and it's available for other companies and engineers to use. But just for argument's sake, let's imagine that you actually worked at Google back in 2001 and that you worked on protobuf. You would have been working on a highly specific, very internal tool that literally wouldn't have seen the light of day until almost a decade later. And if you would have been using protobuf at Google and then left, you could be sure that that was not a technology that another company would have been using back in 2001 all the way until 2008. So whether you like it or not, some of the things that you're going to learn at big tech companies really might not transfer nicely to be able to be used at other companies. And it's worth pointing out here that protobuf is one of the technologies that became open sourced, but there might be other internal tools that you're stuck learning, maintaining, reading about, and using that will never see the light of day. But internal tools actually aren't the only thing that stay trapped at companies sometimes. Sometimes people do as well, thanks to their golden handcuffs. Golden handcuffs are used to refer to benefits, typically deferred payments provided by an employer to discourage an employee from taking employment elsewhere. Golden handcuffs are largely one of the reasons that some people choose to stay at large tech companies for an extended period of time. And while many people know the very common perks of big tech companies like free food, snacks, massages, in-office gyms, and many other things, two of the most important deferred payments of golden handcuffs, in many large tech companies, employees are given end-of-year bonuses for adequately carrying out their job responsibilities. And an end-of-year bonus for adequately meeting expectations typically tends to hover around about 15% of that employee's yearly salary. And most of these companies actually have rating systems that they use to bucket employees based on their respective performance. Better performance, bigger end-of-year bonus. The catch? You have to be employed with your company through the end of that year in order to receive your end-of-year bonus, which typically is paid out within the first few months of the next year. And if that's actually not enough reason to always celebrate New Year's with your company, there's also something else to sweeten the deal called restricted stock units. Are units of stock gifted to an employee at a particular cadence? Depending on the company and the number of shares of stock that you're entitled, RSUs can be awarded on a yearly, quarterly, or even monthly basis. New hires are typically given a dollar amount of that company's stock called an equity grant, which will then vest over the next 4 years that they're at the company. And this equity grant is then converted to a specific number of shares, typically using the 30-day average of that company's stock shortly after you join. If I joined Google with an equity grant of $100 and the 30-day moving average was $10 after I joined, I would be awarded 10 shares of Google stock that would then vest over the next 4 years that I'm at the company. But every single year that I'm with the company and I'm adequately performing my job responsibilities, I could be awarded additional equity in the company that will again then vest over the next 4 years. So every year at the end of the year, assuming that I'm doing my job, I'm guaranteed a significant portion of my salary in cash and additional equity in my company, both of which come together really nicely to basically make it convenient to leave my company basically never. And while this isn't financial advice, looking back historically, it actually pays to stay at high-performing companies. How much? Well, I mean, if you joined Google 10 years ago and you sold all of your initial equity grant at the height of Google's stock, your initial equity grant alone would have netted you about a 700% return, and that's not including any of the additional refreshers you would have gotten each year that you were with the company. What's even crazier is that as you move up in level, your financial incentive typically becomes directly tied to the company, which is often reflected directly in the stock price of the company. Meaning the longer you stay at the company, the more equity you gain. And assuming that the equity continues to grow, the harder it continuously becomes to leave. Now for the 3 most common myths that people fall for when they're joining big tech companies. First, big tech companies aren't immune to layoffs. And if you need any proof, literally Google any of the large tech companies over the past year and just look at their news, and you'll probably be sold on this one. Second, it's not guaranteed that you're going to have good work-life balance in any of the large companies that you work at. It's really hard often to actually predict the kind of work-life balance you might have at these companies just because of how big that they actually are. Take Amazon, for example. Amazon employs over 1 million people to run countless products. Assuming that the work-life balance is the same at any of these companies, let alone good, is a very dangerous assumption. The third myth that I hear constantly is that you're going to work on cutting-edge technology. And that's not always true. You're not always going to work on shiny things. Just because a company has cutting-edge technology does not mean that you're necessarily going to be the one producing it. It's actually your job when you join the company to determine and suss out what the things are that you're going to be building and what technologies you'll be building them with. If you guys enjoyed this video, be sure to drop the video a like and subscribe to the channel for more. I'll see you guys next time.